Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. Like you said, my name's Jennifer Therkorn, and I'm from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different types of tools and methods that we've been developing and looking into at APL. I've worked with Steve on all these projects, as well as another set of people on our project teams, so I'm excited to talk about some of the different things that we can actually do in the field for collecting measurements and actually measuring exposures as opposed to asking about it or doing some sort of retrospective thing. I'm going to talk to you today about three specific different tools and methodologies that we've focused on so far in our work. One of them is silicone wristbands. Second one will be low-cost sensor technology for particulate matter. And then the third one, I'll touch a little bit on satellite remote sensing. You've probably heard about the silicone wristbands by now. They've become very popular in a lot of different research and a lot of different types of environmental health research. Just a little bit of background on the silicone wristbands. In 2000, the National Academies actually put out a report recommending that the DoD should develop a simple wearable sampler to document all the different unknown exposures that people encountered during their deployment. Around 2014, a lot of research started to come out about these silicone wristbands. They've been put into a lot of different types of studies. People put them on children to see what their children are being exposed to in the home. They've been put on pesticide applicators and farmers. They're simple to wear. They're light. They cost cents. They're fun to wear, so they were great in the kids' studies. So we got a internal research and development grant to look into these wristbands because they had a lot of potential because they're so small. The research up to that point had shown that the wristbands could capture thousands of different organic compounds. So our two different goals that we had when we approached this internal research and development grant was, first of all, proof of concept. Are the published results actually as good as they seem? And then our second goal was to specifically look into, could we apply these to the different compounds that you would expect for deployed service members to be exposed to? And to help guide the selection of which compounds we used for this research, we used the Thomas Suto list. Thomas Suto, he's at the Naval Research Lab, put together a document prioritizing a bunch of different compounds of concern for deployed service members, inhalational and ocular exposures, based on the commonality for the use of these different compounds and the seriousness of the health effects that would occur. So for our proof of concept tests, basically we wanted to see, could we recreate the published methods, the published literature methods? And to start to do this process, first you have to condition the wristbands. So all the people in the literature so far have been purchasing the wristbands from the same company. You can have them manufactured by this company at a facility in Texas, or you can have them manufactured for cheaper at a facility in China. We chose the Texas facility because the manufacturing plant in China, the wristbands come with many more contaminants on them than you would get from the Texas facility. But even when you purchase them from the Texas facility for a higher price, they still have a lot of contaminants in them. So you have to go through a not insignificant process to clear these contaminants out of them so that you can then put them into your study and have some sort of baseline of understanding of what you actually captured on them. We tried a bunch of different compounds, again, selected from the Thomas Suto list. First thing we tried was parathione. It's a pesticide, represents more of like a heavier compound, and we applied these to the wristbands by a direct infusion process. Basically, we just deposited right onto the wristband. So this represents something more of like a contact exposure. So the wristbands not only represent inhalational exposure, they also represent skin contact exposure. We then did adjacent infusion with the wristbands using two different compounds, TEP, triethylphosphate. It's something that's commonly used as like a nerve agent stimulant, and DMMP. We didn't actually select that one out of the Suto list. That one we selected based on some conversations that we had with some colleagues in the Navy who said that DMMP, which is a flame retardant, was of high concern for submariners. There are a lot of flame retardants on submarines. As you can imagine, a fire would be terrible. But at the end of the day, it's also very well known to be an endocrine disruptor. So we wanted to see if potentially we could use the wristbands to document DMMP exposure. We did adjacent infusion approach for those two compounds. They're something that would represent like a lighter compound, so this would be something that you would expect to volatilize. We applied the compounds in droplets cut with ethyl acetate so that they would then volatilize out and apply those droplets next to the wristbands in a headspace container so that we would see what got taken up by the wristbands. You then go through a rinsing process, and then we tried 2 different extraction methodologies to pull the compounds back out of the wristbands. We tried solvent extraction for TEP and DMMP, and that's the thing that's been most published on in the literature. It's literally a series of ethyl acetate baths. And then we tried a thermal desorption method for the parathione. The thermal desorption method is actually, it's more at like the leading edge of the research of where all of the new research is being pushed for this particular work. We worked a lot with a colleague of ours, Mitch Rubenstein at the Air Force Research Lab, who's kind of led the way in a lot of the work for developing the laboratory analytical methods for the silicone wristbands. And then after you extract the compounds back out of the silicone, you put it into GCMS to figure out what you had. Basically, the takeaway message from this work is that the methods really matter. So, and a lot of the methods come down to how do you get the compounds back out of the silicone. And a lot of people always ask me, well, if you shower or something like that, won't the compounds just kind of wash out? And the answer is no. You have to do a significant amount of work to get these compounds back out of the silicone, and the method you choose will affect the results that you get, and that will affect the assumptions that you make for what people are being exposed to. If you want to look more into this issue, Kim Anderson's group, Kim Anderson at Oregon State University, her research lab has basically pioneered a lot of the silicone wristbands work, and she put out a publication in 2017 kind of trying to set the stage for standardizing how people are publishing their methods on the silicone wristbands work in the literature. And it's a good resource to look into. Second step in this research, we did a pilot scale field test. We took the wristbands and we put them out at a gas pump on our campus. The point of doing this work was we wanted to see if, for example, you put a wristband on a deployed service member for a long amount of time, how would the results look compared to something that would be a reference sampler. So for this work, we put the wristbands out next to the gas pump for 1 week. We chose the radiello passive badges to be our reference sampler because we wanted to use something that would be a reference sampler but also a passive sampler so that we could try to, as best as possible, directly compare the results across them. The compounds that we were looking for were the BTEX compounds, something that's just very commonly associated with fuel vapors, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, also associated with a lot of different types of cancers and health effects. So we also were told that these were compounds of concern for deployed service members by some colleagues at the Army Public Health Command. The results from this work. On the right side, you can see the results from the radiello passive badges, which are commercially available passive samplers. We bought the badges that were tailored to the BTEX compounds. On the left side, you can see the results from the silicone wristbands. We have a row for each of the different compounds that we were looking for, and then different columns for were we able to detect. So did we capture enough of these compounds to surpass the limit of detection? And the answer is yes, we surpassed the limit of detection for all the different compounds we were looking for both of the passive samplers. Then we asked the question, were we able to quantify? Did we surpass the limit of quantification for all these compounds? And the answer was yes for the radiellos, but no for 2 out of the 5 compounds that we were looking for the silicone wristbands. And I want to clarify that when I say quantification, I mean what we can get from these passive samplers is a relative mass. You can get a relative mass of what compound was captured by the wristband. So what's the takeaway message from this work? So far, I think it's safe to say that the silicone wristbands provide a very reliable, simple, cost-effective method for yes-no profiling for what compounds a person might come into contact with. So yes-no as in perhaps this profile of compounds can be associated with this person. But if you wanted to then figure out what concentration in the environment that person was exposed to, we can't do that with the silicone wristbands because it does not have a controlled surface area of exposure that you can then back calculate the amount of the compound that diffused into the silicone. So we can say yes, no, but we cannot get concentration data, and therefore we cannot get dose data. So I think that is the next major technical hurdle for moving forward with the silicone wristbands. Next, I'll talk a little bit about low-cost sensors, specifically looking at particulate matter sensors because that's where we did our work. But obviously, there's lots of low-cost air quality sensors for other types of air pollutants. We got a internal research and development grant through the Ignition Grants program at Johns Hopkins APL to develop different types of technologies that could be used in a disaster-based scenario. And so the disaster-based scenario that was the inspiration for this work for us was the California wildfires. And for the California wildfires, we wanted to develop a low-cost yet accurate particulate matter sensor that could give you real-time data accurately over a very large geographic area. Why this is important. So there's in the world of low-cost particulate matter sensors, there's a bit of a dichotomy. You have your very accurate but very expensive sensors. Things that are used for federal equivalent monitoring for PM 2.5, PM10, things like your BAM 1020 monitors that the EPA puts out for the different state regulatory monitoring stations. But they're in the order of tens of thousands of dollars. So I don't know if we can imagine the military purchasing many of these and placing them all over an installation. Plus, they're very heavy, extremely heavy, and take up a lot of space. But then you get down to the other end of the spectrum, and there are many commercially available low-cost particulate matter sensors that are coming out now and that are currently available. And they are much more reasonable. They're in hundreds of dollars, for example. But they have been shown to be extremely inaccurate, especially in humid conditions. They're based on optical particle counter technology, and it's also very much biased to giving you very high answers when you're in high concentration environments. And so I spoke with many different colleagues who were involved in doing the on-ground response to the California wildfires, and they all kind of said the same thing. We were purchasing these low-cost sensors because they're better than nothing. But as we placed them out, we were very skeptical of the data that we got back because it could be factors greater than what it actually is. So our goal was to start to dig into this issue and figure out, could we develop a concept for something that would be low cost but also accurate? For our proof of concept experiments, we asked ourselves, can we accurately quantify particulate matter loading onto filters by a low cost-effective method? And something that we looked into for this, first of all, we put out small particulate matter samplers into an urban setting. We collected different amounts of particulate matter onto the filters across a series of days. And then we wanted to know, could we use a low-cost combination of an LED and a light sensor? An LED providing some source of light on one side of the filter, light sensor on the other side of the filter, and could we use that to provide real-time data to tell how much particulate matter got loaded onto that filter? So the concept for this sampler would be, for example, like a rolling filter tape. So you would collect some particulate matter onto one spot on the filter tape, take your reading, and then roll that filter tape forward, and then do another collection and a series of readings. So I would say that this is something more of a hybrid sensor sampler concept, and it would be near real time, not immediate. So for this experimental concept setup, we made a little arrangement here where we were able to kind of control the amount of background light that filter was being exposed to. We collected our filters in the field, brought them in, and then sandwiched the filters between what you see there on your left side. On one side of the filter is the LED, which is providing light. On the other side of that filter is that light sensor, which is providing lux measurements. And the idea was, can this little setup that cost about $14 tell us with some sort of degree of certainty that there was more particulate matter collected on this filter versus this filter. And I thought our results were actually pretty exciting from this small experiment. On the left side, you see the lux measurements provided by the light sensor across each of the different filters that we used for this study, starting from the clean blank filter, and then each of the filters that had particulate matter collected on them, and then the experimental setup without any filter in it. And the question we asked was, can we detect differences in light penetration? And the answer was yes, we do, and it makes sense. So there's more light that got through the filter that was our blank background filter than compared to the other filters. On the right side, we see lux measurements versus something that we call our time-weighted state regulatory air quality monitoring measurements. So in the town where we collected the filters, there was down the road a state regulatory air quality monitoring station, and we pulled the air quality index readings and then weighted it by the amount of time that we ran that filter sampler for. This is what you have to do when you have a small grant. So, and the question that we asked ourselves here was, do the measurements correlate with real-world data? And we were pretty excited because the answer is yes, with a very good R-squared value. So I think that what's exciting here is that we have a concept that could potentially move forward and provide that hole in what's commercially available right now for low-cost sensors. All right, and then the last topic that I wanted to talk a little bit about is satellite remote sensing. So what we see here in this map, all the little dots represent where there are currently regulatory or government level regulatory air quality monitoring stations. And what we see that's pretty obvious is that there's major holes in this map for where we can get ground-based data that we trust, that's collected at a given frequency with a certain level of confidence. And many of these also correlate to where we have people deployed to. So what's exciting about the satellite remote sensing is that it has the potential to kind of fill in these gaps in the map. And an idea that has come up recently with the air quality community is perhaps we can take both satellite remote sensing data and ground-based measurements and fuse them together to provide a more complete picture. And what we see here in this figure on the top row of the maps is the ground-based data. That's the data that's collected by your samplers on the ground. On the left side is the actual PM2.5 measurements, and then on the right side is our certainty or uncertainty in these measurements. The middle layer of graphs shows what the satellite remote sensing data was, what data came from the satellite remote sensing for the PM2.5 concentrations and then the certainty in those measurements. And then down on the bottom is the result when these two types of measurements were fused together. And so what we end up seeing is that not only do our estimates in the PM concentration change, but we also have an increased, much greater certainty in these measurements. And so something that would be an exciting area for improvement moving forward is how we can actually bring these together in a way that is both efficient and accurate. So we worked a little bit with some of our colleagues in the space sector at Johns Hopkins APL to see if we could put to use some programs that they had already been running for other purposes to see if we could measure different types of air pollutants using these same programs. And this program is called WRF-Chem, Weather Research and Forecasting Model coupled with chemistry. We have people in-house with expertise who can run this program. And just for a small proof of concept, what ended up happening is our colleague measured concentrations of air pollutants in a 1x1 kilometer resolution grid. She used the instrumentation on the MODIS satellite, which passes over the Earth at a certain number of times. That goes over once daily, and then pulled this data to then estimate these different air pollutants using the WRF-Chem model after she integrated the data from the sensors. Basically, we can see that while what we're looking at here is the southeast United States, but the actual accuracy that we can measure down to using this WRF-Chem model is down into the 1x1 kilometer grid. So we have some data that we pulled here for sulfates, PM2.5, ozone, ammonia, and CO2. So what is our path forward at this point? I think that all of these different topic areas could certainly be used or put to use, but they all require some more work. More work needs to be done in this area to actually put these different types of exposure assessment tools and methodologies out into the field. And so we have some suggestions, some ideas for how this work can be pushed forward. For the silicone wristbands, for example, obviously we need to do a lot of more research to understand how the performance of these wristbands are affected by different harsh conditions that you would expect, both in not only during their use, but also during the storage. So for example, if these things in a ConOp setting, you'd think that they'd get used and then they get stored and then they get shipped back, and where they're getting shipped to and how they're getting shipped. All these things need to be thought about. How do these wristbands actually correlate to some measure of dose, or how do they actually correlate to health impacts? These are other things that need to be looked into. For the low-cost PM sensors, there's a lot of commercially available ones, and if you want to look more into the work that's been done to validate the performance of these low-cost sensors, I would direct you to the AQSpec website, AQSPEC. It's a great website. It's being run by the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and they've done a lot of really great work to try to set the baseline of how we're testing these in a laboratory chamber and then out into the field. These low-cost commercially available samplers, just putting it out there and saying, you want to buy these, you want to put them into your study. This is how they compare across all these other samplers that are out there. So if we're going to move forward with any other concept, ours or others, then this type of rigorous testing needs to be performed. And then for the satellite remote sensing, I think it's a very exciting and potential solution for filling in the gaps. But first, there needs to be some work done, probably within the United States, for example, where you have a very, you have an air quality monitoring network where you trust the results and then see how well or how efficiently you can fuse the data from the ground-based samplers with the satellite remote sensing data. And so that's it. I'd like to thank you again for having me here and thank my project team, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for sharing with us some of the opportunities going forward. I'd open it up now to the committee for questions or comments. Sferi?
Yeah, just a detailed question. So the issue about quantification with the wristband, I didn't quite get that, because you said, well, you showed that you could get quantification for some organic compounds but not for others, and the reason you sort of poo-pooed the issue of quantification was you couldn't back estimate dose or concentration because of something to do with surface area.
Sure.
Why is that specific to certain compounds and not others?
So for these results here, the methods that we used in our laboratory setup, our limit of quantification, which normally you find your limit and then you kind of go up 2-3 standard deviations and then you call that your limit of quantification. We were not able to surpass our limit of quantification with our setup in this particular pilot study. Now, getting to the issue of how we can actually get dose information, that's not specific to this pilot study. That's a bigger issue related to the silicone wristbands themselves. So limit of quantification here, that's one thing. Dose information, that's a limitation of the actual wristbands. So the wristbands, so if you have a passive sampler and you want to understand an environmental concentration, airborne concentration of a compound, you have to understand the geometry of that sampler and how its surface area is being exposed to the air so that you can then understand the amount of the compound that was diffused, absorbed into that material. And then that, in your estimation, allows you to then estimate the concentration in the air for that compound. Now, the wristband, it's touching your skin, it's touching the air, it's moving around, as opposed to the radial badge, which was specifically designed and it sticks out with a very specific geometry, and that's why we can get. Okay, so if we wanted to use the wristbands in their current format and their current form factor, we can understand total mass that gets sorbed into the compound. But because of how they're used, we cannot get airborne concentration data. And if you wanted to get dose data, you'd have to understand what the airborne concentration is. And we can't make those leaps.
Brief question about your the low-cost particulate matter sensor. It sounds like so far the work has been at concentrations of PM that you would expect to be in everyday settings locally. And so I was wondering what your projection is about the ability to perform well in very high concentrations of particulate matter.
Sure. So I think that the next step that we proposed for this work that we're waiting for funding to get into doing is obviously getting into the upper and lower extremes for what the sensor is capable of seeing. We bought a $6 light sensor. I think we can start to broach the subject of more sensitivity if we kind of bump up that cost and bring in a better light sensor. But outside of the light sensor LED combination, the actual sampler itself could potentially, for example, if you brought in something like, I don't know, something that was smarter than just simply applying the particulate matter onto the filter. You could then kind of fluctuate the flow rate that you use depending on the environment that you're in. So that would something be like a learning system. It's kind of getting into like more of like AI or data science or something like that. But I think that's just something that we'd have to dig into by addressing it by two different approaches, the hardware and the software side.
So assuming you got the funding and things went really well, how close or when could you envision actually having this available for the kinds of applications that we're talking about?
You're referring to the low-cost PM sensor?
And particularly the silicone.
Oh, for the silicone.
wristband.
Okay.
Yeah.
We could put the silicone wristbands out tomorrow.
Understood, but you've got testing that you'd like to see.
Sure. So if we wanted to, so that all depends on what you want to use the silicone wristbands for. So we have, for example, colleagues at the Air Force Research Lab who have done a lot of work on developing their laboratory analytical methods, and they're kind of tailored to analyzing these wristbands. Now, assuming that you have properly conditioned your wristbands and packaged them and got them ready to go, we could put them out into the field tomorrow, hypothetically, and then bring them back and understand a profile of yes, no, these are the compounds these people came into contact with. Now, if we wanted to then sort of develop some sort of confidence bubble around, well, they sat here for months and it was really hot and they got exposed to sunlight, then you're going to have to kind of, sort of dive into those specific environmental stressor conditions to understand how that might have affected your result. If you wanted to start to dig into, for example, this issue of concentration and dose, then we're going to have to start doing research on form factors, for example, so that we can then get into that area. So it all depends on the question you'd want to answer.
I have a few more questions about the low-cost sensor. How often do you have to change that tape? Is it, can it have little human intervention, or is it?
So this is literally, so our small grant, this is what we made. So, but
Not too automated.
So yeah, it was a associate staff just, but the BAM 1020, for example, by Met1 Instruments, it's used right now for a federal equivalent method sampler for PM10, PM2.5. It's very expensive because it uses a super sensitive method for detecting the amount of PM2.5, PM10 that gets loaded onto the filter tape. I actually worked as an intern with a company that ran those sensors for one summer, and we had to go out and check the tape at least weekly, if that gives you some indication.
Total mass, it's not actually a PM that's on the tape, right? You had measured it by lux, and so is it representative of a total PM mass?
Yes, correct. We use the button aerosol sampler, which pulls in, it would be an accumulated total. It's not PM10 or PM2.5 because of the sampler that we used.
Okay, and I also have a somewhat recommendation, since you mentioned satellite data. Sure. This is a lux measurement, meaning that it's sort of an optical measurement. What's coming from the satellite is actually optical depth. I would recommend that you would...
Lux measurement? No, this is for, the lux measurements are for the low-cost sensor.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, for the
I mean,
satellite.
you correlated the lux with the AQI, air quality index, meaning you were correlating the...
So the AQI data came from the local air quality stations, BAM 1020s, PM 2.5 and PM 10. Okay, all right, okay. I see what you're saying. Yep.
Is that maybe you
okay.
could try for your own experiment, because if you're recommending satellite data, you could look at the satellite overpass where you put your sensor and see how that relates, because that would actually be very useful for in theater to see that relationship, because that's what has to be converted anyway.
Yep. Cool. Thank you.
So thank you very much for sharing with us the development of some of these tools. We look forward to hearing more about them. And good luck with your funding.
Thank you so much. Okay.